Bom dia, good morning. So now we have our morning session of this 9th meeting with Professor Kritin, which will talk to us about Kant's schematism in the neo-Kantianism. And well, I let Professor Kritin do his talk.
Yes, thank you very much. Please let me start by expressing my thanks for this kind invitation to Sao Paulo by Professor Porta and Professor Pringe for his help concerning the infrastructure. Well, in fact, for me it was rather difficult to prepare the presentation because I'm not familiar with, so to say, the level of intimacy of the audience regarding Kant and neo-Kantianism and contemporary transcendental philosophy, while at the same time, of course, I want to stick to my own standards. So I try to find a kind of Solomonic solution. Roughly speaking, my talk consists of two parts. The first part will make clear that there is a certain tendency in neo-Kantianism and post-war transcendental philosophy, contemporary transcendental philosophy, to overcome Kant's dualism of basic concepts. And that is very important for dealing with the problem of schematism, and that is what I will show in the second part of my paper, namely that this whole problem of schematism turns out for these later transcendental philosophies as the problem of methodology. And what you see then is that Kant's conception of foundations in terms of a philosophy of consciousness is completely transformed into a philosophy of objective functions, and regarding specifically then schematism, these turn out to be functions of methodology. So that is the major thesis I want to present. The form is a kind of problem-oriented historical investigation, Probleemgeschichte. And especially in the first part, I think, I'm a bit afraid, but maybe it's just a misjudgment of my side, that the leading thoughts are maybe not so familiar to you, and therefore I will say the same thing 4 or 5 times, just every time from the perspective of another philosopher. So it's impossible to miss the point. But it is possible to get bored. So, let's wait and see. Okay, in 2 recent dissertations about Kant, the problem plays a major role that has always played a role in the discussion about Kant's philosophy, and which through Heidegger even became a kind of vital question, the problem of schematism. The broad spectrum of interpretations of schematism is rather surprising when one takes into account that Kant himself labeled the chapter on schematism as one of the most important parts of the Critique of Pure Reason. The spectrum reaches from its superfluousness, because of the transcendental deduction of the pure concepts of understanding, up to supplying this deduction originally. Well, but it cannot be overseen that in the discussion, the systematic attempts of the transcendental philosophy of Southwest neo-Kantianism and of transcendental philosophers in post-war Germany, strongly influenced by neo-Kantianism, for example, Hans Wagner and Werner Flach, attempts to relativize Kant's heterogeneity of the 2 sources of knowledge, Stämme der Erkenntnis, sensibility and understanding, by a foundational unity, are not discussed as such. And Hegel's attempt to overcome Kant's dualistic conception by a structure of self-mediation of the concept is also not discussed, at least seriously, as a competitive offer. Yet, both for Kantian transcendental philosophy, and I mean now with Kantian transcendental philosophy, this post-Kantian tradition of Kantian type of philosophy, Kantian transcendental philosophy and Hegel's speculative idealism, Kant's schematism, for Kant so important, one of the most important parts of the Critique of Pure Reason, does not play an important role anymore. It's disappeared, more or less. Why? Rather, both aim to solve Kant's problem of schematism, not by letting it rise in first instance. So it's also a kind of strategy, and this is what we will see now in my paper, how this works. So in what follows, I shall show this with regard to Kantian transcendental philosophy. It is my thesis that Kantian transcendental philosophy gives relief from a weak point of Kant's transcendental philosophy. I will not go into the issue of whether they can cope sufficiently with Hegel's challenge of the concept. For sure, however, the present discussion is in need of perspectives that go beyond the usual lines of interpretation if we really want to get insight into the relevance of Kant's idea of schematism. Now, to start with, there is no disagreement about the fact that Kant's chapter on schematism deals with the problem of mediation that results from Kant's architectonic of theoretical knowledge. The heterogeneity of intuition, representatio singularis, Einzelvorstellung, and concept, representatio generalis, Allgemeinvorstellung, needs to be brought into a relationship concerning the concrete determination of objects. Concrete determination of objects. Insofar, schematism concerns generally the relationship between an indeterminate content, Inhalt. Yeah, sometimes when I use the English word content, I will specify it because I cannot make a distinction, a proper distinction between Inhalt and Gehalt. Both is translated as content, but Gehalt is a unity of form and content, and Inhalt, so to say, an opposite concept for form. So when I think there's a problem, I will just say what I mean. Generally, the relationship between an indeterminate content, inhalt of knowledge, and its determining form, and not a traditional subsumption of universals and individuals. Both this general form and content have to be brought together in an adequate way. For this, according to Kant, scheme is needed. Schema is needed. Be it a schema of pure concepts of sensibility, of empirical concepts, of pure concepts of understanding, or even a schema of the idea. Schemas function here as, so to say, rules for the application of rules. More precisely, as conditions of applications of rules. In this respect, for Kant, the issue of schematism addresses a necessary principle of mediation regarding form and content. The principle, if there would be no schema, the principle would remain a mere function without being capable of representing an object. There would be no object as a form content. Without schemes, as Kant says, the activity of understanding, as well as the unity of reason that results from it, so concrete knowledge, would remain indeterminate in itself. Although the issue of schematism has a general meaning that goes beyond the specific meaning of the mentioned types of schemas, in view of the transformation in subsequent German idealism, I will focus on the foundational level of the relationship between intuition and category, or pure concept of understanding. Categories are pure concepts of understanding. This focus concerns why? Because this focus concerns the basic structure of the cognitive relationship, the relationship of knowledge, the basic structure of knowledge, as conceived of by Kant. And for Kant, that the cognitive relationship, or knowledge relationship, is a relationship between intuition and concept, form and content. Decisive for Kant too are the transcendental schemes as conditions of the possibility of knowledge. Now, what problem then does the schematism of pure concepts of understanding, of categories, intend to solve? We could say, that's part of the thesis, a problem of concretization of knowledge. The chapter of schematism is not about justifying the legitimate use of categories as principles of the determinacy of objects, as is the case in the chapter on transcendental deduction. Rather, it has to make plausible how categories can be applied to objects. So it's a later phase of constitution, more concrete level of constitution. The categorical synthesis of understanding, of course, does not make an object, but this object is given for Kant by sensibility as an object that is in need of determination by thought. The universal form of sensibility is time. Objects appear in time. The category, as Kant holds, is regarding the object given in time on which it is applied totally heterogeneous, not homogeneous. Yet, subsumption of an object under a concept presupposes homogeneity. But how then can categories, pure logical, timeless concepts, be applied to objects given in time? Well, for Kant, this requires a mediation, as he says, a third factor. That is, a very specific representation. And this specific representation should be pure and both sensible and intellectual, or as Kant also says, a priori governed. It should be, therefore, homogeneous with the category and the appearance. In the background of the heterogeneity that needs to be overcome by schematism, in the background, this is very important because later transcendental philosophy will focus exactly on this point. In the background of the heterogeneity that needs to be overcome by schematism stands a more general heterogeneity of intuition and concept, or sensibility and understanding, continuously emphasized by Kant. As Kant says in a chapter on schematism, pure concepts of understanding are compared to empirical concepts or even sensible intuition, completely non-homogeneous. Completely non-homogeneous. From this, the mentioned heterogeneity of category and appearance results, the problem of schematism. The latter presupposes the former, so this dualism in schematism presupposes this more general heterogeneity of concept and intuition. If the transcendental determination, it is the transcendental determination of time that for Kant fulfills the required condition of homogeneity. It is like the category general and based upon a rule a priori, and homogeneous with the appearance as time is contained in every empirical representation of a manifoldness. The transcendental determination of time is for Kant the scheme of the category. Here, concrete knowledge of an object is achieved. Concrete knowledge of an object is both pure synthesis and an immediate relation to an object. Contingency is conceived of as a categorical founded unity, that is to say, as concrete determination of an object. Insofar, I think, at least this is what you need to know from my talk, insofar the application of categories and appearances as objects of knowledge is clarified. Kant's thesis of a complete heterogeneity of category and appearance involving the need of a mediating schema with regard to the concrete determination of objects, hence knowledge, knowledge of objects is concrete determination of objects, is sufficient to assess that in Kantian transcendental philosophy such a schema is missing, at least as a basic element of the definition of knowledge. Kant's problem of schematism concerns here, at the most, a subordinate issue, not a fundamental problem of the theory of knowledge. What are the reasons for this significant transformation? First, to refer to an evergreen of Kant scholarship, it cannot be an irrelevance in the sense of Cam Smith informed by Curtius. His argument, intuitions and categories are or not fully heterogeneous, otherwise subsumption would be impossible, or the opposite is the case, with the result that schematism is superfluous. It's a really simple, short argument. For some interpreters, this criticism is supposed to be not only close to neo-Kantian interpretations, but also an expression of an Aristotelian type of ontological hyletic sensualism. Well, this interpretation touches upon two intrinsically related perspectives that are indeed relevant for an assessment of the Southwest neo-Kantian dealing with the problem of schematism, although the result is completely different as sketched here now. First, for Southwest neo-Kantianism, the relationship of form and content qualifies the validity structure of knowledge. In this respect, it is beyond any onticism, or so to say, empirical theory, of a sensible matter that obtains non-sensible forms by thought, resulting in a cosmos, resulting in a formed entity. By contrast, the relationship concerns, to speak with Kant, two types of representations. Intuition as a representation of an individual, and the concept as a representation of something general. Hence, it concerns a relationship of capacities of reason, modeled in Kant, in the fashion of a theory of representations, hence not an ontology of different types of being. For Kant, the manifoldness of given representations, intuitions or concepts, is unified in an apperception by means of an activity of understanding that exactly is the logical function of judgments. Therefore, the manifoldness is determined with regard to a function of judgment that brings this manifoldness to consciousness. Moreover, as the categories are nothing but these functions to judge in their significance for the content, inhoud, and hence for reality, any manifoldness of a given intuition stands under the condition of categories, according to Kant. To phrase it with Hegel, being is a determination of thought, or as the neo-Kantian Rickert puts it, content is itself a form. Objects are always objects of knowledge. Hence, the relationship at issue, or the problem of mediation, concerns what we could call an intra-gnoseological relationship within knowledge, structure of knowledge. On top of that, in first instance, it does not concern the relationship of category and object, but of intuition and concept. The object as a constituted entity is always already the result of a categorical synthesis. The issue of schematism concerns the problem of determination of concrete objects, the concrete determinacy of objects, or as Kant puts it in this language of subsumption, subsumption of objects under a concept. Categories are attached to concrete objects. Pure concepts of understanding apply to sensibility under the conditions of sensibility. In this way, it becomes apparent why we are capable of making fundamental statements, or what Kant calls synthetic judgments a priori, about nature as an object of knowledge. From the pure concepts of understanding flow synthetic judgments a priori that subsequently function as general principles, in Kantian language, Grundsätze, des reinen Verstandes, for any knowledge of objects. These principles establish constitutively the concrete determination of objects. Categories, therefore, are not merely related to sensibility in general, but related to sensibility in a concretizing way. Determinacy is singularized, vereinzelt. Categorical determinacy is transformed into a general determinacy that leads to a singularized determinacy. This singularization of determinacy is the subject matter of the chapter of schematism. Heterogeneity, the intellectuality of the category, and the intuitive manifoldness of the inner sense, the sense, the inner sense, representatio generalis and representatio singularis, are mediated, and the scheme is the third factor, the a priori conceptual representation that mediates both. The unity of synthesis, modeled in terms of a theory of apperception, is mediated with a singular intuition, and the result then is a unity in the determination of sensibility, the concept. This finally leads to Kant's conception of the empirical world as world governed by natural laws. The doctrine of schematism develops the laws of the empirical world as laws that are subordinated to the laws of pure understanding, concrete determination of objects, knowledge of nature, and according to Kant, is lawful determination. So this is the first point. Second, the Southwest Neo-Kantians do not conceive of the cognitive relationship in the fashion of a theory of representation, as Kant does. So this is a very important transformation. Not a philosophy of consciousness, not a theory of representation, but they conceive of the cognitive relationship in terms of structures of validity. Knowledge is addressed regarding the structure of its validity. This structure is a structure not of capacities, powers of reason, but of functions of validity. Kant's idea that knowledge is conducted in judgments and concepts are based upon functions of judgments leads in Southwest Neo-Kantianism to a conception that qualifies knowledge as a whole of principles in the sense of functions of objective determinacy in its validity. By contrast, Kant gives this pure determinacy logical issue of determination of objects oriented towards judgment, as we could say, an apperception theoretical turn. This whole idea of apperception is also missing in a way in Southwest Neo-Kantianism. At least it is substantially transformed. Or reject that the I think is the highest point of philosophy. But skip this. Kant gives this whole issue a perception theoretical turn. He integrates, why? Because he integrates the competence to determine objects by the I think in his conception of foundations of knowledge. From a systematic perspective, it is not last Kant's own distinction between a subjective and an objective deduction that has led subsequent transcendental philosophy to what you could call a primacy of the foundations of knowledge determined in a validity, noemetic, or objective logical dimension. So a dimension of structures of content and not of forms of apperception. So to say the subjective logical dimension. And in a dimension that concerns the content, now Gehalt of knowledge. The what is known, not the act of knowing, takes center stage. And therefore this whole idea of apperception and consciousness gets a different role. Okay, so consequently the issue of a knowing subject that appropriates the object of knowledge is at the most a subsequent theme. The function of an I think as the highest unity of apperception, that is Kant's formulation, is rendered explicit in a validity noemetic fashion. Now, as said, the Neo-Kantians thematize Kant primarily from a systematic and not from a historical perspective. Notwithstanding the fact that Neo-Kantians like Cohen, Bauch, or Cassirer provide extensive Kant interpretations too, the spiritus rector of Southwest Neo-Kantianism, Wilhelm Windelband, phrases it very clearly. Understanding Kant means to surpass him. And then what means understanding Kant and surpassing? That is to develop Kant's thought further. Be the better Kantian. Neo-Kantianism basically is about the problem of validity. Kant's contribution to philosophy is valued regarding his insight in the problem of validity as well as in a method of how to cope with this problem of validity. Yet, Kant's contribution must not only be reactivated, but also, as we could see from the quote of Windelband, reactualized or modernized or revised. For the Neo-Kantians, Kant's transcendental, and what Kant calls the transcendental, is essentially a whole of grounds of validity. This whole cannot be captured by turning towards a being beyond the cognitive relationship, but only by turning reflexively towards thought as the grounds of all validity. The objective validity of concrete accomplishments of meaning of subjects is based upon a whole of principles of validity, as Kant would say, conditions of the possibility. The objective validity of these principles of validity or conditions is justified by showing that they function as validity conditions of knowledge. That exactly is the proof. So no reference to an external instance. Like Kant, both the Marburgian Neo-Kantians and the Southwest Neo-Kantians are eager to determine the determinacy of knowledge via the determination of the validity, determinacy of cognition. But taking Kant's transcendental philosophy as a theory of validity and not as a theory of consciousness, metaphysical and psychological deprivations are extinguished or at least subordinated to the overarching validity theoretical doctrine. Regarding the first dimension of the schematism problem, this foundational background dualism of intuition and concept, or sensibility and understanding, Kant's transcendental aesthetics was heavily criticized not only in the early phase of German idealism, but in Neo-Kantianism too. Already for Hegel, Kant does not develop both sources of knowledge, Stämme der Erkenntnis, from the concept, but picks them up merely empirically, in particular from psychology. The Neo-Kantians basically are of the same opinion. Without doubt, the problems Kant's philosophy aimed to deal with emerged in the context of German metaphysics of his time and British empiricism. In this context, Kant poses a question concerning the relationship between knowledge and its object, and answers it with a critique of pure reason. The Neo-Kantians, though, are positioned in a situation characterized by other problems. In their time, German idealism had declined and German empiricism arisen. By returning to Kant, the neo-Kantians intended to sublate both tendencies. It is not surprising then that their treatment of Kant leads to a different systematic conception of philosophy. So the first component of Kant's transcendental aesthetic, this does not satisfy Southwest neo-Kantianism, concerns exactly the mentioned background dualism, and hence the problem of constitution addressed by Kant's transcendental aesthetics. The problem of the meaning, of the function and justification of both sources, Stämme, themselves. In the context of my talk, it suffices to point out to the tendency, decisive for Southwest neo-Kantianism too, to develop Kant's dualism of sources further in the sense of their unity. This culminates, as we will see later, in Ricketts' model of a theoretical object in general. Here it becomes apparent that form and content are part of the concept of thought, as thought, theoretical thought of something. This content does not refer to any specific content, but content itself, the inhoud, turns out to be part of the model of an object, belongs to the formal factors of a theoretical object as such. On this most fundamental level of self-relation of objective thought to content, particular forms like, these Kantian forms like time and space, do not play any role at all. Content as such is, as Rickett puts it, the logical place for the illogical. It guarantees, what does it mean? It guarantees the relatedness of thought to content, and with this it makes possible a plurality of specific contents. The result of this is a different, more uniform model of constitution of experience in its original determinacy, in its primary constitution. But this, so to say, epistemological issue at the same time functions as the basis for a subsequent methodological issue of knowledge of the non-philosophical sciences, so of course paradigmatically the empirical sciences. And that is the second component of Southwest criticism of transcendental aesthetics. The reproach here is that Kant's transcendental aesthetics, with its form, time and space, restricts that what is given immediately to what is given by the senses. For Ricketts' theory of knowledge and science, as for his ontology, this second component is equally important. Both components are essential parts of Southwest's reception of Kant's transcendental aesthetics of the critique of pure reason. This second component concerns, so to say, not section 1, paragraph 1, which is about the function of intuition, but section 2 following, which is about the forms of what has been intuited. Both components are relevant for the problem of schematism. The first concerns Kant's dualism of sources versus Ricketts' model of an object, that is, in the discourse known as Ricketts' heterology, guiding whole Southwest neo-Kantianism. At issue here is the basic structure of knowledge as a model of validity functions of cognition. Both Kant and Rickett propose a whole consisting of two parts. For Kant, two sources of human knowledge, as continuously emphasized. He develops the determinacy of these sources in section 1 of the Aesthetics and returns to this at the beginning of the Transcendental Logic and talks of two basic sources of the Gemüt, receptivity and spontaneity, Anschauung, intuition and concept, as the elements of all our knowledge. Knowledge then qualifies itself by the moments of intuition and concept, or sensibility and understanding, or receptivity and spontaneity. These two sources of knowledge make up its fundamental determinacy. They are the basic principles of knowledge. They constitute knowledge. Knowledge, therefore, in this perspective, is an interrelated validity function and whole of principles of intuition and the concept of aesthetical and logical conditions. Consequently, knowledge in its validity structure oscillates between indeterminacy and determinacy. The aesthetical and logical conditions of knowledge constitute both the givenness of an object as well as the thinking of an object. Via sensibility, the object is given. By understanding, it is thought. Correspondingly, Kant distinguishes principles or forms that guarantee the knowledge function of intuition, the forms of time and space, and principles or forms that guarantee the knowledge function of thought, the pure concepts of understanding or categories. These both elementary functions of knowledge define knowledge in its basic structure in two directions of constitution. Both cooperate in the constitution of knowledge. To use this famous quote of Kant, thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind. Both powers or capacities cannot interchange their function. Only because they unite themselves, knowledge can emerge. So the transcendental aesthetics thematizes knowledge as a representation of an undetermined object, a singular representation. Intuition represents the object immediately. The relevance of intuition, sensibility, or receptivity for knowledge is that it supplies material for knowledge. It establishes the indeterminate object in need of determination. Hence, we could say a substrate of possible determinations starting from the Empfindung, Sensatio, sensation, Sinneseindruck, as the lowest genetic level of representation with consciousness. That's to say an effect of an object on the capacity to represent as far as we are affected by it. Taken in itself, this level, however, concerns a mere subjective perception, completely indifferent to validity. It's just material for knowledge. The intuition Kant talks about is, however, not a merely validity irrelative sensation of impression, but already an a priori forming of the supplied material. Empirical intuition is only relevant for knowledge because pure intuition guarantees its relation to an object. So that's, so to say, the idea of these forms. Regarding this function of representing the object immediately, intuition is both opposed to the concept as a mediated representation of the object, or is opposed to the concept as a mediated representation of the object. Together with its validity functional counterpart, thought, intuition makes up the determinacy of the content of knowledge. Although the forms of intuition, space and time, are intuitive and not conceptual in nature, the forms of intuition not identical with the categories, their validity function is to guarantee the validity relevance of the material of knowledge. So that what identify or what unites them is that they both are validity functions. Within the whole of validity functions of knowledge, they play a constitutive role. The relationship between intuition and concept in the theory of constitution is that the relatedness to sensibility is a condition of the possibility of knowledge. Pure intuition is for conform, and hence a principle of relations, an a priori factor of possible determination of objects. In this respect, intuition and concept do not differ. Only together, pure concept and pure intuition make objective determination possible a priori. Both sources of knowledge are captured in their function for knowledge, in their, we could say, validity relevance. By implication, they are subordinated to the one principle that is knowledge, and interpreted transcendental philosophically. The cognitive relationship is qualified in its meaning not by a hypostasis of two irreducible elements, or heterogeneous elements, but the validity functional togetherness of two moments of the one that is knowledge. Essentially, the moments of indeterminacy or non-understood manifoldness and determinacy of knowledge, determined content, inhoud. This is the core of the matter Kant is dealing with. The Southwest Neo-Kantians stick to this core, but they reject Kant's conduction of it. They're very dissatisfied with this. Now, I will explain this a bit more. The Southwest Neo-Kantian Bauch, and our host, Professor Porta, wrote a very important dissertation on Bauch. So the Southwest Neo-Kantian Bauch, possibly the best of all Kant interpreters, commented both in his comprehensive book on Kant, as well as in his major work on theoretical philosophy, on the problem of schematism. Already from his Kant interpretation, decisive aspects concerning the basic structure of knowledge are brought to light, in first instance in the context of his elaborations on transcendental aesthetics. On the one hand, Bauch wants to discuss the knowledge-functional concern of Kant's transcendental aesthetic. The thematic validity function for Bauch is that of establishing a substrate of determinations. On the other hand, Bauch argues against Kant's radical dualism of knowledge sources. Both are, as Bauch holds, I think correctly, different validity conditions, validity parts. The principles of sensibility too are discussed by Kant in the perspective of objective validity. Due to its own task, for a science of all principles of sensibility a priori, and that is, so to say, Kant's determination of transcendental aesthetics, sensibility, despite the original duality of thought and intuition, cannot be fully illogical. Rather, for Bauch, already here the idea of an logical in the illogical emerges. Intuition only has relevance for knowledge due to the concept of knowledge. The concept of knowledge makes up the task of transcendental aesthetics as a transcendental discipline, a transcendental aesthetics. Accordingly, Bauch pushes Kant's conceptual instruments to the sideline and lets the logical or validity functional place of thought in the concept of knowledge take center stage. Although sensation does not determine the object, the material of sensibility is relevant for knowledge, the a posteriori part of the logical as the sphere of the form. That the material of sensation is given is a condition of the possibility and hence formal determinacy of knowledge. The a posteriori, therefore, itself an a priori. Form and matter belong together intrinsically. Whereas the matter, materie, is given to us in its material content, the form enables that the manifoldness of the appearance, das mannigfaltige der Erscheinung, as Kant says, can be ordered. For Bauch, this enabling also hints towards the relationship of intuition and thought, and hence of transcendental aesthetics and transcendental logic. The a priori means for Bauch the logical lawful meaning qua condition of the possibility of knowledge, and hence the relationship between receptivity and spontaneity, from the matter of sensations to the forms of thought. It is only because the form of spontaneity as the sphere of the logical rules even a matter of sensations that sensations logically belong to the concept of knowledge. Bauch lays down precisely the logical relationship between form and matter in its systematical meaning. It leads him to a whole bunch of complaints about Kant, although Bauch himself also tries to relativize his criticism, at least concerning the fundamental aspects, by a kind of very famous, in general in an idealist tradition, letter-spirit strategy. In the letter says this, but the spirit, and then there comes something completely different. From early Kant research on, and for Bauch too, Kant's doctrine of the two sources of knowledge does have a certain ontic characteristic, despite their objective logical meaning. This duality remains guiding for the critique of pure reason, notwithstanding the fact that Kant aims at linking both validity functions in concrete knowledge. The possibility of knowledge itself requires their unity. And although Bauch concedes that Kant's method of isolation of form and matter, sensibility, as well as of sensibility and understanding, is not meant as an objective separation of different issues that belong together, but as a methodological distinction in the sense of a point of view, the reproach of isolation in the critique of pure reason, according to Bauch, is essentially correct. For Bauch, this isolation finally leads to an abstraction, as in the critique of pure reason, in particular in the transcendental aesthetic, becomes obvious. Kant sticks to the independence of given empirical material and logical forms. Yet for Bauch, there just is no principle, in this case given material, that is independent of the logical principle or equally original. As Bauch shows, the respective parts only have their determinacy in relationship to each other. A firm dualism of form and content distorts exactly the issue at stake. As a result, Bauch claims objective reason as the missing foundation. Kant sticking to the thing in itself is for Bauch, from a logical perspective, nothing but a futile attempt to guarantee the independence of the object from the subject. Here too, Bauch wants to guarantee the validity claim of the empirical material by the necessity of the concept. In short, the initial dualism of sources, this background dualism, is the awkward situation. It should be replaced by a more original relationship. Bauch opts, conform Kant's transcendental revolution in philosophical thought, for reason as the ultimate foundation, more precisely for objective reason. Objective reason for Bauch is the foundation. Not only in the context of objective reason can the sensation obtain its relevance for knowledge, its logical meaning. In line with Bauch's persisting validity functional theory of determination, sensations themselves and the like are always already determined categorically in order to be material, sensation, or whatever at all. Without categorical laws, there are just no objects to intuit. A situation like material without categories for Bauch is a complete empty abstraction, not conceivable even as material. And that would already involve the form material. Kant's famous sentence, thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts blind, for Bauch cannot mean that empty thoughts or blind intuition do exist in one way or another. Both are mere abstractions, results of a philosophical reflection. As Bauch says, the emptiness of thought and the blindness of intuition, respectively, have only meaning as their pureness, and hence as different objective validity laws. Regarding the fact that both are objective validity laws, there is no principal difference between intuition and the concept. Intuition, or the laws of intuition for Bauch, have the validity function to include the content of sensations, Empfindungsinhaltlichkeit, the manifold material in the categorical network of validity in order to determine intuition conform the law of the concept. Hence, the laws of intuition cannot be fully or in principle independent or detached from the laws of the relationship of categories. In any case, objective validity is at stake. As law determinacy, the laws of intuition are subjected to categorical laws. Consequently, Bauch does not model the distinction between types of validity laws as an isolation in need of a mediator. That was, so to say, the Kant concept, different sources which have to be mediated. As the unity is already apparent in any concrete object of intuition, as determined by transcendental laws, according to Bauch. The material of knowledge is included in the forms of the validity relations of objective thought. And it is in this context that Bauch makes remarks on the problem of schematism in Kant. For Bauch, Kant fails to understand the relationship between intuition and concept adequately, as for him most evidently is the case in schematism. Although time and space are no categories or concepts, in Kant the distinction turns into an isolation, according to Bauch, in need of a unifying mediator, despite the fact, recognized by Kant, that without such a unity, neither an object of intuition nor the intuition of an object is possible. Pure intuition and category or concept are not separated from each other, but belong together in the determinacy of the concrete object by laws of transcendental logic. Transzendental-logische Bedingtheit des konkreten Gegenstandes. An artificial unification, schematism, is superfluous here. In a similar fashion, Bauch notes in his book on Kant that initially Kant isolates intuition and concept fully, although this isolation is only possible in abstraction and reflection, not in knowledge itself. And this becomes fatal in Kant's doctrine of the principles of pure understanding, these Grundsätze des reinen Verstandes, context of schematism. As the initial isolation is not taken as a mere product of reflection, but as an objective constellation. The problem of application is modeled into a problem of uniting intuition and concept by a mediator, by a third factor, by a schema, although they are already united by the concepts of transcendental and that of synthesis. In short, Kant finally pays the price for his procedure of isolation and abstraction. An artificial mediator is needed. Bauch addresses the chapter on schematism from this perspective. He rejects the idea of a complete inhomogeneity of intuition and content. But this exactly was the constellation that has led Kant to the problem of applying categories to appearances. For Bauch, a completely pointless problem. There is no sufficient reason for introducing and mediating a third factor, that is transcendental scheme. Okay, so although in his interpretation Bauch continuously speaks of mediation between category and intuition, whereas for Kant the application of categories to appearances is at issue, I think the direction of impact is clear. Bauch aims to overcome the original heterogeneity by an original unity in the concept of knowledge. Consequently, Bauch renders explicit the internal laws of validity of this unity. Therefore, there is no mediation. It isn't making explicit the internal content of the unity, not mediating externalities. This is the basic idea. By implication, a scheme is superfluous. In Bauch's discussion of Kant's problem of application, that is the problem of concrete determination of an object, it becomes clear that regarding Kant's schematism that the sensation of equality becomes a structural element of the object of intuition by the concept that puts together the object as a categorical unity of a manifoldness of its elements. In order already to be sensation, sensation is already always embedded in a web of categories, of categorical relationships, and not a mere modification of the state of the subject which experiences it, not merely subjective, but in order to be subjective like this, already objective. Of course, Bauch does not want to give up the positive meaning of schematism, that it is its justified or legitimate validity function, but he does so without referring to a third factor. The unity of category and intuition is guaranteed by the category itself. The schema, too, is categorially conditioned. Its positive meaning boils down to, as Kant says it himself, to be a rule of determination of our intuition in accord with a certain general concept, a method or procedure to provide a concept its image. Intuition is determined by the concept. This determination of intuition by the schema that the category gives to itself in order to give itself an image, that is to determine intuition, for Bauch makes up the good sense of schematism. The schema is the fundamental relationship of unity between the category and the determination of intuition. Otherwise, categories would, as I said in the beginning already, remain functions of determination without being capable of representing an object. In actual knowledge, category and intuition are what they are only in relation to each other. Now, so far, this issue of originality in Bauch. It already points out to the issue of the logic of determination of a concrete object, and I will come back to this in part 4, because, or in the second part. Second part, it has to become clear how then this concrete determination is solved in Neo-Kantian and post-Neo-Kantian transcendental philosophy. But first, I will just illustrate this thought referring to some other Neo-Kantians. And I will look at you because as it is the same thought, it could be a bit boring and I can just skip it. But anyway, for Kohn, the issue of originality is like Jonas Kohn, the issue of originality is like we have seen in Bauch. Kohn's doctrine of utraquism is the evidence for this assessment. Utraquismus. Utraquism concerns the relationship between the ultimate or basic moments of knowledge, form and content of thought. Thought form and thought content. Kohn holds that the content is alien to thought, denkfremd, insofar as it cannot be deduced from thought but is given to thought. However, in order to be thinkable at all, that what is alien to thought needs to contain form, that is, at least the form of being given. Only then it becomes related to, that is, relevant to knowledge, part of the realm of knowledge. The ultimate moments of all that which is thinkable are not only conceivable, are only conceivable in reciprocal correlation. Both an unformed content and a form without content cannot be part of the realm of thought. Therefore, Kohn criticizes any fixed, not non-utraquistically conceived opposition of concept and intuition, dualism of sensibility and understanding, as a result of a rather primitive psychology, mixing up concepts of powers and values unwholesomely. Kant's dictum of intuitions without concept, thoughts without content, is, as in Bauch, being developed further towards its unity, that is to say, utraquistically, conceived of as a necessary knowledge-functional relationship. For both Bauch and Kohn, there just are no empty thoughts or blind intuitions. And within Southwest Neo-Kantianism, only Emil Lusk's doctrine of judgment is a serious exception. Bauch, Kohn, and Rickert too, they all reject Lusk's doctrine as not radical enough. Explicitly referring to Kant, Lusk introduces namely a constellation that for the critics does not exist. Something that is absolutely independent of the logical, merely given, logical amorphous material, that is logically naked and material substrate becomes equipped with predicates, a mere logical addition by knowledge, and thus becomes placed within the categorical determinations. And aliens to thought in this sense is, according to the principle of thought, just impossible. The origin would turn into an hypostatic dualism of category and matter that is supposed to exist independently from categorical enclosure, categorically uninvolved. Yet material as material of knowledge contains from the start categories. Hence, Lusk seems to feign fixed elements of knowledge. By contrast, content itself is a logical principle. Material independent of validity, not involved, alien to validity, does not exist within the realm of knowledge. As Rickert showed, guiding Southwest Neo-Kantianism, the minimum what is thinkable consists of form and content, of a logical and an illogical factor. It is not surprising that in Lusk's scholarship, Lusk's theory of validity has been seen as a positive reception of Kant's schematism. But we can also say that Lusk's conception of ultimate foundation seems to enable possibilities for a more reconciliatory reading. But this then would tie Lusk much more back, or back even stronger, in the tendency of Southwest Neo-Kantianism to search for unity. But I will skip this as too detailed. Okay, and I mentioned already a couple of times the hero of this model of relatedness for Southwest Neo-Kantianism is Rickert. I will say some words about that. Rickert, with his model of an object, Modell eines Gegenstandes überhaupt, has famously, and for Southwest Neo-Kantianism, decisively tried to conceptualize the relatedness of the parts of the origin. From a systematic point of view, the tendency we saw in Bauch and Kohn to develop Kant's fundamental dualism of knowledge towards a unity culminates in Rickert's model of an object. It determines conceptually the origin of knowledge, the theoretical realm itself, of the ultimate presupposition of any concrete theoretical determination. The origin establishes theoretical objectivity and hence the cognitive relationship itself. Kant's sources of knowledge are integrated in the model of an object regarding their primary constitutive meaning. Accordingly, that model establishes at the same time a substrate of possible determinations of knowledge. Content turns out to be the logical place for the illogical. It is in this function that what is determinable and needs to be determined is made explicit. And so far as the origin constitutes the possibility of any determination of objects, the logical sphere of origin does not yet concern immediately thought in its determination of objects, but only in its first beginnings of thinking of an object. Due to its foundational function, the origin qua beginning of thought is, however, also the beginning of a process of determination. It contains the basis of determinacy of the logical sphere of determination too. Yes, but I have the idea that this already has been clarified by what I have said, so let me just skip some things. Yeah, so this last remark, that, to make a distinction between the realm of origin and then the realm of determination of objects, that is now, so to say, the key for understanding what will follow, especially in the second part. So we can say only within the cognitive relationship, concepts like form and content have meaning. We have seen that. And then instead of picking up some non-validity factor, something not constituted by thought, at the most there are levels of relative originality, layers of a priority, and this will be the essential thought in part 2 of the talk. So this whole idea of concretizing knowledge is conceptualized in terms not in mediating external factors, but in specifying several layers of a priori functions. And one of these functions will be the function to determine concrete objects. And this is, so to say, the transformation which takes place in post-Kantian transcendental philosophy. The idea of a relative originality or layered a priority offers the key for solving exactly the problem Kant was aiming at with his doctrine of schematism, of the critique of purism. And I will discuss this a bit later. For now, at least, we can see how this whole idea of form and content works here in Southwest Neo-Kantianism. That we are dealing with a kind of intra-gnoseological turn in thinking about the grounds of knowledge, and that requires to understand content or being, material, whatever, as a form in relation to what Rickert would call the content of the content, which we can only undergo, intuit, or experience alogically. If there would be merely receptivity, there would be neither knowledge nor objects of knowledge. We would never overcome, so to say, the stream of consciousness. From the perspective of constitution on a primary level, it is the form content as such that enables that any content enters the cognitive relationship. So no isolation and so on. This cognitive relationship then is in no way a kind of ontological meaning. It is a pure semantical meaning, so to say, although this is maybe a tautology. It is a pure functional meaning. It's not a kind of ontology of several parts. Now, as a result of the now radical heterogeneity in the origin of knowledge has been carried, and the relationship of mutually and necessarily related parts established. Kant's problem of schematism, however, does not concern a general relationship between concept and intuition, or receptivity and understanding, but the more specific problem of applying categories to objects to knowledge. That is the problem of concrete determination of objects. The problem of concretizing knowledge is in Southwest Neo-Kantianism now not anymore solved via a mediating third factor, but by making explicit the original unity of knowledge, hence by the concept, form, or the idea of knowledge. And this, as I indicated already, leads to a model of layers or levels of principles of objective determination, a prioris. These levels reach from the origin of knowledge to its individualization in concrete objects. I have to see how much time I have. Okay, I have some time. Yes. Now, what is important regarding these layers or levels, that in Southwest Neo-Kantianism, they are discussed in two directions. We could say there is a more subjective logical approach trying to discuss these layers from the perspective of the act of knowledge, and the more objective logical approach trying to discuss these layers in terms of the structure of what is cognized, or the Gehalt, the content. And Rickert is, so to say, famous for introducing these two directions of a theory of knowledge, which plays a big role also in other epistemologies in the 19th century, in the second half of the 19th century. But okay, according um, to Rickert, and I will skip again many things. Well, okay, according to Rickert's heterology, the theory of knowledge does not start with the separation of form and content, subject and object, but such separation appears to result from objective thought itself. All thinkable entities consist of thought, of form and content. Ontologically seen, the given sensible and intelligible world consists of sensible objects that consist of, seen epistemologically now, sensible content and intelligible form, as well as intelligible objects, or figurations of meaning, we could say, consisting of, epistemologically seen, of intelligible content and intelligible form. For a transcendental philosophy on Rickert's level of reflection, there is no radical externality to thought. But, as I said, only layers or levels of originality within the theoretical realm. Of course, a content must be there in order to be recognized, but already content show to be a principle within the realm of validity. And there is something only because of thought. The validity structure of thought is logically prior to any knowledge of being, that, and what something is. The levels of relative originality within the theoretical realm for Rickert reach from the original synthesis of thought in the model of an object as such, to the constitution of concrete objectivity via methodological forms of knowledge. These levels cover the whole spectrum of theoretical determination. By implication, also the concept reality, or the concept of a given, or of a fact, or whatever, must be constituted. Here, of course, not the relatedness of thought is at issue, but the specific meaning of that what is given as material or whatever. For example, scientific knowledge. And that, of course, is a given of a rather late level of constitution, a fact. It's much more specific than the general relationship between form and content. In short, the cognitive relationship is being concretized in terms of a theory of principles, conceptually compressed to concrete objective meaning. Concerning Rickert's philosophy, and I indicated this, we should be aware of the particularity that Rickert addresses the problem of object constitution in two directions, a subjective logical and an objective logical direction. Rickert's epistemological opus magnum, the Gegenstand der Erkenntnis, the object of knowledge, is designed subjective logically, and it is only in the course of several revisions that Rickert was able also to outline the objective logical dimension too. As Rickert propagates a logical primacy of the objective root, so this primacy of the what, of the Gehalt, it is not so much about two roots of knowledge, of epistemology, but about the explorations of two dimensions or reflective modes of knowledge. The theory of knowledge addresses qua doctrine of the validity, determinacy of knowledge, always the one Gegenstand der Erkenntnis, and this now means the object of knowledge is a measure, so discusses the measure of knowledge, the standard of knowledge. This concerns two dimensions. On the one hand, knowledge is thematical as that what is thought, as an objective figuration, as an object. The objectivity of knowledge is at issue here. It concerns validity as an entirety of principles guaranteeing the objectivity of cognitive performances, standards or whatever, criteria, norms. Whereas on the objective route, the object is thematical in itself and hence detached of the cognizing subject, the knowing subject. The subjective route deals exactly with knowledge as cognition of an object by a subject. So here the subjectivity of knowledge is at issue. This concerns validity in its logical performance. Or could maybe also say intentionality. Within the realm of cognition, that what is thought as an objective configuration has to be distinguished logically from that through which it is thought as a subjective configuration. And these two different issues of the theory of knowledge not only lead to different determinations of knowledge, they also have different points of departure of epistemology or validity reflection. The theory of knowledge always departs from a fact, a factum, always some type of reality upon which is reflected in. The subjective route, also called by Rickert the transcendental psychological route, departs from the fact of knowing, from the act, the real act of knowing. And from this subjective act, the theory of knowledge makes its way gradually to the object then, which turns out to be a transcendent object in the sense of that it is in its validity independent of the act. But the act depends on the determinations of the object. So it makes its way gradually to the transcendent object, is the ground of all objectivity from the subject to the object. The objective route, also called the transcendental logical route, treats as soon as possible and regardless of the psychological act of knowing, the transcendent object in itself. The objective route progresses pure logically. And so then the content is analyzed. It's a judgment. The judgment has a certain structure. We can distinguish between several predicates and so on. So we can talk a lot about this without referring to the cognizing subject. So this is in essence what it's about. So in contrast to the subjective approach, for the objective approach, the question about knowing the object by a subject takes a back seat. Therefore, the starting point of reflection is not the subjective logical fact of knowing, but the objective logical knowledge, the supposedly true proposition. Now, I would have a part where I would lay down this very detailed, especially concerning the subjective route, and I will just skip it because I'm rather sure it will bore you if you're not already familiar with it. So let me just sketch the whole idea. So what is happening then on this subjective route, or this transcendental psychological route? It is that Rickert shows that on any level of knowledge, knowledge is always about appropriating content by an act, and it is in fact irrelevant. So whatever we have knowledge about, it turns out that's always a result of a cognizing act, recognizing forms and bringing together and uniting them in a concrete gehalt. So, and this applies not only on this level of originality, it also applies on the level of what is reality, what is a knowledge of a reality, the different types of knowledge of reality, so let's say natural sciences or humanities and so on and so on. Always, what is at issue is always a result of a subject recognizing forms. Okay, and then in that sense, Rickert even calls the structure of appropriation categories. So this is rather particular because of peculiar, because for Kant, of course, categories are not determinations of the act of knowing, but of the objects of knowledge. And this already points out to the second route, this objective route, which Rickert also discussed, but I think the hero of this is Bauch. So I will immediately go to Bauch, and then you can see, in general at least, how this functions. So skip everything here. Yes. So, but maybe in short, the thesis then of compatibility, to speak with Kant, category and appearance, is so to say guaranteed on this level of making explicit all these forms of appropriation. The logical dependence of everything that in one way or another is of the forms of thought and knowledge leads Rickert even then to surpass the subjective logical determinations towards this objective route, and I will discuss this regarding Bauch. As for Rickert, for Bauch too, reality is an important philosophical problem. What reality is, what it means, that it's given and so on, how we can have knowledge of it, how it must be in order for us to have knowledge, and so on. Accordingly, as for Rickert, for Bauch too, the notion of a fact, for example, becomes an epistemological problem, or a given becomes an epistemological problem. As Rickert, Bauch too sharply criticizes this distinction, so important for realism, between that and what something is. As in Rickert, this boils down in Bauch also to showing that both Dasein and So-Sein, existence and quality, are posited in knowledge and therefore subject to the laws of validity of knowledge, for the known to become an object at all, or even to logically be at all. Bauch, like Rickert, takes reality as a philosophical problem that can only be solved in a truly in a scientific way by an idealist approach. So the idea is to say that we have to accept empirical realism, but only because we have tried transcendental idealist arguments for it. So Bauch fulminates then in the course of this against an abstract conception of the concept and conceives of form and content as an intrinsic relationship. Continuously it turns out that being in its possibility is founded itself in thought. This results, like in Rickert, in a transcendental idealist transformed concept of an object. The object qua standard or measure of knowledge is for Bauch, like for Rickert, not an existing reality, but the whole of relations of validity, Geltungsbeziehungen. That's what the object in the sense of the standard is. So the standard is, so to say, not an object in terms of a being, but the whole of validity relationships. Actual, concrete, real knowledge subjects itself to such relations, it thus becomes valid. They, and hence the concept, is the object qua measure for the cognizing subject. Both for Rickert and Bauch, the ground of reality is a non-reality, a non-real realm. Just as Rickert, Bauch too rejects realism as an adequate epistemological position, while at the same time accepting empirical realism. The foundations of reality are transcendental in nature, a validity condition of empirical reality. And in his methodology of the empirical sciences, Bauch just follows, despite several modifications in detail, and his more objective logical perspective, Rickert's approach. Now, to Bauch's theory of knowledge as an objective logical theory and the surpassing of Kant's schematism as a mediating third factor it entails. To be sure, Bauch also takes the subjective logical dimension of knowledge into account. He integrates, so to speak, both roots of Rickert, but in a more uniform way, and from the start, under the in the perspective of primacy of the objective logical perspective, of objective logic. As a consequence, the significance of forms of knowledge as principles of objective determinacy, so not of appropriating determinacy, but of objective determinacy itself, becomes very clear. For Bauch, the problem of knowledge both concerns the dimension of cognizing, knowing, and cognition knowledge. Yet the former has to be developed from the latter, from the theory of knowledge in an objective perspective. Both the object as well as its cognition underlie mutual conditions, conditions of truth. Whereas knowing shows to be a process of relating, with, which regarding its validity can only direct itself towards relations of validity, of truth, the object turns out to be a relation itself based upon truth relations. Truth relations and the truth is nothing but the whole of these relations, therefore are objective logical and hence trans-subjective relations. Bauch conceives of them as objective validity functions. Object for Bauch implies to stand in relations, and knowing to direct oneself towards relations. So it's more precisely, both the constitution of the object of knowledge and the cognition of the object by subject takes place via three types of truth of validity relations: the category, the concept, and the idea. Concerning knowledge of real objects, in first instance, the order of the content of sensations by which the object is given is at stake. For being a sensation at all, sensation must be part of a relationship. For example, they must have an identity, they must be different than others, and so on. This relationship is that of the category. As for Kant, yet differing from Rickert, Bauch conceives of the category strictly in its objective logical meaning, as principles of the objective determinacy, not relations of knowing, but of that which is known. All that is real presupposes them. The category itself, then, is part of a relationship too, determining the object, thing, property, cause, effect, one, many, and so on. This object-determining relationship of categories is for Bauch the concept. The concept is, as he puts it, the objective law of formation of the object as an object of knowledge. The concept makes up the relationship of the categories. At the same time, the objects are constituted by concepts and hence categories. The relationship of the concepts is the foundation of both our knowledge of objects and the objects of knowledge. This whole philosophy of relationship finally leads Bauch to the whole of all relationships, and that is the idea. The idea is a system of concepts, and hence the objective validity relationship that as the whole of conditions of objects constitute reality and its knowledge. Validity relationships are conditions of the objectivity of objects. Thus they are themselves not objects. They underlie all being from the start and persistently. Like Rickert, Bauch too elaborates his thought, this thought also regarding the method of concrete object determination qua knowledge of reality. To the fundamental structure of truth also belongs the method itself as the way to the truth. In short, Bauch holds that knowledge has a validity noemetic structure that covers the whole spectrum of determinations from the origin of objectivity to the determination, to the determinacy of concrete objects, while at the same time this cognitive relationship remains completely within itself. And basically, last remarks then already. Basically, this is the same story in Kantian, in post-war Kantian transcendental philosophy of Hans Wagner and Werner Flach. Here too, for solving the problem of concretization of knowledge, no Kantian schema is necessary. Kant's doctrine of schematism does not play a role on the basic level of foundations. Yeah, well, just for the sake of time, I maybe take this all together and only say something about Hans Wagner, because this is a rather simple model which makes very clear to you what is the direction of overcoming Kant's idea of schematism. So to start with, for at least for Wagner and Flach, it is important that both develop their philosophy in terms of a validity noemetics, that is under the primacy of Rickert's objective root, the root of the Gehalt. Systematically, they follow therefore Bauch's approach. Kant's dualism of two sources of knowledge is under influence of Neo-Kantianism and others, revised and transformed into a cognitive relationship that integrates validity noemetic and validity noetic aspects. And now, here we do not have a twofold structure, but a fourfold. Wagner distinguishes four fundamental parts of any theoretical figuration: subject, object, performance, and content in the sense of Gehalt. In different terms, Flach does the same. And although Kant too offers ideas how to integrate subjective validity noetic and objective validity noemetic elements into the model of knowledge, I think these later transcendental philosophers revise Kant's dualist model, in particular in this respect. And this revision follows Kant's own idea of the primacy of the validity noemetic perspective. So this objective root of Neo-Kantianism. In Wagner then, the problem of concretization Kant addressed in the chapter on schematism is solved very explicitly by a model of layered a priority. This model provides specific principles for concretizing knowledge. That is the so-called regulative and systematic a priority. For the knowing subject, these are normative constraints. They result in the course of Wagner's validity noemetic reflection. As Wagner writes, it is the only possible foundation of a general theory of reflection, the reflection on the principles of validity of that what is thought, and hence not from a reflection on that I think, that is excluded even as a conception. Knowing an object for Wagner means assigning the appropriate determinacies to the object via judgments. The judgment is a unity of the concept of the subject in the sense of the subject matter of a judgment, and the predicate. The concept of the subject in the judgment represents the object, that is to determine, and which has its own determination, but for knowledge is still undetermined. The concept of the predicate, or the series of predicates, determines the concept of the subject, and thus thinks the determinacy of the object of knowledge. For Wagner, the judgment is a noemetic relation of determination, not a type of subsumption, but determination of the concept of the subject by predicates. For knowledge, this implies that it is validity related to validity. and validity different. So can be valid, but also invalid. Our determination of the object by predicates. On the basis of this knowledge, functional interpretation of the judgment, principles emerge that establish the determinacy of this cognitive relationship, and hence the structure of the theoretical noema, content, Gehalt. This structure makes up its fundamental validity determinacy, and with that the validity functional elements of the relationship between thought, qua thought of, and object that we call knowledge. Thought is here conceived of not as a natural entity, but as a principle of objectivity. As the principle of objectivity, it differentiates itself logically into what is thought, in the sense of thought of, and object of thought, subject and object, mind and world. To be sure, in the case of empirical objectivity, that what is given in the senses, for Wagner, indicates the factual. Nevertheless, it is thought that assesses and decides what is truly and not merely supposedly factual. With regard to its validity, thought cannot recur to external instances, but stands on its own, and so on. Like Rickert and Bauch, Wagner holds that the theory of knowledge, which takes its point of departure for determining knowledge in the separatedness of the two parts, subject and objects, mind and world, goes astray, even if Kant himself falls sometimes victim to this. The separation emerges from thought itself as thought-interested knowledge. As a principle, it relates itself to something which differs from itself, its concrete instance. Now, insofar, it also becomes apparent that Wagner, on the level of the origin of knowledge, cannot accept any radical dualism of heterogeneous factors. Rather, thought concretizes itself as a principle. Of course, the objective validity regarding the respective object must be warranted, but this exactly is assured in a way that the concrete thought of objects obeys the laws or norms of knowledge. And it is exactly here where the idea of a validity noematic level, or different levels or different a priorities, comes into play. For the principles of knowledge, which guide or determine the cognizing subject, are not a homogeneous whole, but they are different types, each with its own grade of fundamentality. And Wagner distinguishes four levels, and I will close with that. Primary constitutivity forms the most fundamental layer of the principles of knowledge. They constitute thought as thought, the noema that applies to the object as a noema, which subsequently can apply to an object. Wagner's doctrine of primary constitutivity provides, in terms of a theory of principles, the definition of thought qua noema as such, yet in its function to be able to determine the object, thought as thought of, and hence thought in its knowledge functional determinacy. Then Wagner distinguishes a secondary a priority, a whole of principles that constitute the being of entities, sein des Seienden, the beingness of being. This whole of pure concepts of being is not merely formal, but constitutes the content of thought. On top of these two layers of consecutive a priority, Wagner offers a whole of regulative a priori principles, and even principles that guide the systematicity of knowledge. Hence, the sets of principles that contains the means for knowledge to accomplish its intention of determination, to accomplish the full concept of being. The regulative a priority concerns methodological principles guiding the route of research. The systematic a priori principles do in fact the same thing, but orient specific knowledge toward a system of knowledge. And with these four layers, the inner structure and division of the system of the principles of knowledge is complete. And so, in this whole idea of methodology guaranteeing concrete determination of objects, this is, so to say, a constant factor in all the post-Kantian transcendental philosophy, in the perspective of, or at least, in the perspective of Southwest Neo-Kantianism, also Flach, and I did not talk about it now, more in particular at Bauch and Rickert, but there it's the same. So we can maybe say as a conclusion, the positive meaning of Kant's schematism for post-Kantian transcendental philosophy is not to elaborate on the need of a mediating factor between heterogeneities, but it is methodology. The objective structure of methodology. And that also makes up its, I would say, its significance beyond addressing this whole idea of mediation in terms of philosophy of consciousness. Concrete determination of objects is objective logically guaranteed by methodology. So this was my talk. It was a bit long, excuse me, but I hope you could pick up the essential aspects. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Krienen. I will, before going to the questions, I have to do some comments here, and I will just briefly point to some aspects, more historical aspects of the discussion of the schematism, referring mainly to Lotze. But one thing that is curious is that even from the 19th century up to now, there is a clear tendency to disregard or not take seriously the schematism in Kant. And like it was a complement, superfluous addition in Kant's theory of knowledge. But there is a little known passage in the Opus Posthumum, which of course was not known in 19th century, but which reveals the intentions of Kant. And up to the end of his life, Kant was not trying to abandon the schematism, but in the contrary, to widen the scope of the schematism. There is this very strange passage where he talks about the schematism of living forces in the Opus Posthumum, and he tries to apply the schematism not only to the theory of knowledge, but to the transition of the metaphysical foundations of science to physics proper. And so there is like a familiar resemblance of some things that will reappear later in neo-Kantianism in the final moments of Kant's life. And my other point, my other main remark concerns Lotze. Lotze may be seen, considered as a mediating figure between Kant and the neo-Kantianism. And in Lotze we find a very considerable reflection about schematism, which is curiously present in the lesser logic, in the Lieder logic published in 1843, and which is abandoned or given less proeminence, at least in the greater logic, which received more editions and was more widely read. So I just point to some of the Lotze considerations about schematism, and what I think that is particularly interesting in the case of Lotze, it's that he gives a clearly logical role to the schematism, and not only epistemological. Of course, the discussion of schematism in Lotze comes from the critique of Hegel. Like you pointed, there is no schematism in Hegel. Maybe there could not be really a schematism in Hegel. And Lotze believes that this is a symptom of the gap, the unbridgeable gap that there is in Hegel's system between reason and experience. For Lotze, the principles of being in Hegel's logic are too abstract to be applied to experience, and so we need just to supplement it with something else that he finds in the schema. Kant was right in positing for Lotze the schemata as a mediator between the realms of thought and nature. And Lotze goes back to Kant and emphasizes the role of the schematism in connecting the categories with experience. It's the schematas that do this role. But also in Lotze, a greater role is given to logic in the apprehension of of experience. We all know that Lotze rejected generally the synthetic a priori nature of knowledge, but he accepted the autonomous and spontaneous role given by Kant to the subject and its role in creating or producing knowledge. And And he indicates his middle position with the claim that, I quote, "There are motives in the nature of things that force the cognizing mind to produce precisely these shapes of perception and combinations of objects." And here he's referring to schematism. On the face of it, this seems to be a naturalistic claim, an empirical claim, in that it attributes the laws of logic to the impact of non-logical laws in mind. There is an imprint of experience from which the mind produces after this imprint, the logical laws. It's a different scheme from a different model than Kant. But Lotze, however, strongly opposes psychological construals of the origins of logical laws. When he wants to avoid the appearance of psychologists in his own case, he turns precisely to Kant, and specifically to the schematism of the categories. According to Kant, well, the schematas are rules for producing intuition according to patterns of time determination, and the transcendental imagination applies these rules and brings intuited contents into patterns that make such content understandable according to the categories. In other words, the transcendental imagination produces patterns in which the mind intuits material as the material given by experience as categorically formed. Lotze proposes, in addition to this intuition-oriented schematism, that there is an analogous schematism for the logical form. Just as the patterns of time determination enable the categorical cognition of intuitable content, so also the laws of logic are patterns that enable the cognition of thinkable content. Laws and structure of logic are rules according to which the mind can cognize categorically formed and thinkable, yet intuitively empty content in Lotze. And I quote again, it's from the Lesser Logic, page 29, "Forming schemata in this sense means nothing other than thinking as opposed to cognizing." So the schemata are the presupposition of knowledge. So, for example, Lotze suggests that the logical schema of the category of substance is the concept of the logical subject, and the logical schema of the category of inerrance is the logical copula. There is a clear parallel between logical schemata and acts of cognition. And of course, full cognition requires both intuitive, experiential, and logical schematization of this category. In this sense, Lotze maintains that logic is a formal discipline. Its structures do not apply to actual objects and do not extend to material content. It's not formal in like in Herbert's sense. It's formal in this very peculiar Lotzian sense. Because it must contain an account of the origin of the logical laws. And this account must be grounded in the role that logical laws play in cognition, and how the schemata render possible those logical laws and its application. And it is not real or metaphysical like in Hegel's sense, because while the laws of logic are necessary and binding on for the thinking subject, they are not themselves constitutive of real objects. In Lotze's conception of a transcendental logic, since there is not a conception of transcendental logic in Lotze, but there is an appeal to logical schemata that plays a similar role of a transcendental logic, since he distinguishes logical forms from categories. those things are clearly separated in lots. Transcendental logic is the doctrine of categories, and logical concepts are not categories, but they presume the categories and explicate how it is possible that the categories apply to the thinkable concept. That is in a nutshell, the way that Lotze deals with the schematism in the lesser logic, and what I wanted to know is what kind of is there some kind of influence or reading of those remarks made by the neo-Kantians, because it's one of the few texts, this lesser logic is one of the few texts that takes the schematism seriously in the panorama or in the scenery of 19th century philosophy prior to the neo-Kantians. Basically,
Yes, thank you very much for this very interesting remark, and for me a remarkable remark, which already indicates that apparently I have not seen it until now in the text of the neo-Kantians, this reference. So in general, the idea is Lotze is a kind of founding father in a broad sense of Southwest neo-Kantians. Why? Because he famously emphasized this distinction between being and validity. Dingen die sind, Ereignisse die geschehen und Sätze die gelten. Propositions which are valid, processes which emerge, and things that are. Now, and this is, so to say, a basic distinction for Southwest neo-Kantianism, in general for neo-Kantianism. We have to distinguish between being and validity, and philosophy is about validity, also trying to understand being in terms of validity. So therefore, Lotze is very important in general. But for some Southwest neo-Kantians, he is also very important more in detail. And this concerns, in first instance, of course, Windelband, who had a very close relationship. But for my talk, much more relevant, Bruno Bauch. Bruno Bauch continuously refers to Lotze in very specific aspects. But I can tell you, in this aspect, not. And the only thing what I can, maybe you have another idea, I cannot remember any substantial statement. And and I did not know this too, so if I would now talk from my position, I would say it probably has to do with the fact that this is not in the bigger logic, but in the smaller early logic. And if it indeed, as you say, is, so to say, a bit pushed in the margin, then this would explain why not. But that makes it extremely interesting to find out what is exactly the status. And as you now described it, we can, I think, already see what is the problem then from the Southwest neo-Kantian perspective, that apparently here this whole idea of concretizing or mediation is again structured in terms of a theory of consciousness and of a process of cognizing a subject and so on. And this is exactly what Bauch does not want anymore. So, and therefore, this whole idea of concretizing knowledge is now not described in terms of more specific mediations on the level of acts, but mediations on the level of the Noema, of the Gehalt. And there, the most specific determination is the method. And what we can see here is, so to say, the opposite side. It is in fact a very Kantian idea. And maybe also your first remark to Kant is also very interesting, this opus magnum, opus posthumum thing, that you can really see also here the latter spirit strategy of neo-Kantians, or I would say all systematic philosophers, dealing with Kant. And there are very, very good reasons to say Kant's philosophy is in essence a philosophy of validity. But if you look how this philosophy of validity is being developed conceptually, it is in terms of theory of powers and acts and whatever, and actions, activities and so on, and capacities of reason. And apparently Kant was not, at least from this later perspective, sensible enough to get rid of this. Now, by contrast, even apparently in the opus postulum, he even stretches the idea of schematism instead of getting rid of it. It's kind of opposite development as we have seen now in the development of Rickert, first starting with this subjective dimension where the acts in fact are very important, and then at the end saying, well, the logical primacy is on the level of the noema, of the objective structure, and then further developments which just render this more explicit, even more getting away from any consciousness theoretical or act theoretical or intentional explication. So it's a very provocative and for me very interesting remark, and if you would be so kind to give me that with the places where I can find it, I will for sure go into it. So thank you very, very much.
Now we have time for the questions. Tem o microfone?
Thank you very much, Christian, for this wonderful talk. I would like to go back to your conclusion, which was that at the very end, the problem of schematism turns into the problem or a question of methodology. And I was wondering if, in this way, you are not, in a way, returning to Kant. Because for Kant, as you rightly pointed out, the problem of schematism is the problem of the application of categories to particulars, to these particular appearances. But the doctrine of schematism is not, so to say, the end or the final solution of the problem, but just the beginning of the problem. Because as you know, this problem or this theory of schematism leaves the problem of empirical concepts and their possibility still open. And in order to cope with this problem, Kant has to deal with the maxims of reason and with the use of reason inside of empirical knowledge.
Yeah.
He has to deal with the regulative principles of reason and then with the regulative principles of the power of judgment. So at the very end, Kant is also talking about, in a way, of methodological principles in order to cope with the problem of the particular, in order to cope with the problem of the appearance empirically given in its complete determinateness or determinacy. So it seems to me that at the very end, these post-neo-Kantians return to Kant.
Yeah.
But
well, I fully agree, and Flach would now embrace you, because of course his thesis is that what he is doing is nothing but what Kant already was doing, but for specific problems of his time he was maybe not able to make explicit as precisely as necessary to express his thoughts. So this is very important. And here you can also see this whole idea, what I mentioned 2 times, letter-spirit strategy. Yeah, so if we go to the letter, we seem to deal with a kind of theory of consciousness. But now, if we look at what is at stake concerning the matter, we see that it's about methodology also for Kant. And now, therefore, this letter-spirit strategy does not mean that the spirit does nothing have to do with the letter. It is, so to say, making more explicit what is written there. And what you now say is exactly confirmed this. So I fully agree. Therefore, even Bauch, who has this talk of the positive zin, the positive meaning of Kant's schematism, here it is retained. This is exactly what schematism is about. But then we can ask, what's then the difference? And the difference, and that would now be my question to you, The difference would then be that Kant develops this in terms of a mediation between a radical heterogeneity. And this is exactly what is not anymore part of this whole post-Kantian transcendental philosophy. And then we can maybe say, yeah, we don't need it. It is about a methodology of concrete determinations of objects, and that is what Kant wants himself. But as he conceptualized his theory of knowledge in terms of a dualist structure, even giving that not only a methodological or a semantical meaning, but also a kind of ontological color. Yeah, we continuously are also in need of a kind of mediation between a radical heterogeneity, and this is not at issue anymore in Neo-Kantianism. So, but then we, if you would agree to that, then you also would say, I would say that we are dealing here really with a correct purification of Kant's transcendental philosophy.
Yes, but then my question would be, why are they still talking about methodology? Put it in another way. These principles are not just principles of methodology, they are not just regulative principles, they are constitutive principles. I completely agree with you. I mean, once we have already gone beyond these Kantian distinctions, then this also Kantian distinction between constitutive and regulative must be the constitutive and regulative principles.
Yeah. Well, that is interesting because indeed this whole idea of layered a prioris. Now, in my talk, because of reasons of time, I had to talk about it more in general. But there are big distinctions between the different transcendental philosophers. So, for example, Flach only accepts a logical a priority and a methodology, but not anymore this this more four-layered model of Wagner, and also not a kind of systematic a priority. Well, the idea we can see also in Rickert is rather, I would say, very simple. So on a certain level of constitution, the concept of reality, objectieve Wirklichkeit, is determined. And then the next step is our knowledge. And Rickert then makes a distinction between constitutive forms of reality. So these forms have a constitutive character. And the forms knowing that reality is what he calls methodological forms. And they have a regulative character. Why? Because these forms, they regulate the knowing subject. Whereas when we talk at all about the subject on the level of the constitution of objective reality, there we have, so to say, this subject, this epistemological subject, this subject without flesh and blood. And this is, so to say, nothing but the subjective correlate of any possible objectivity. But on the level of concrete knowledge, we have indeed this whole idea of contingency. We have to make distinctions. We have to separate what is important and not important. We always have to take into consideration certain perspectives of our knowledge interests. And therefore, this principle can only regulate. And in this sense, we can talk about this distinction also in terms of constitutive and regulative principles. But this already is not uniform in transcendental philosophy, and it would be really interesting, maybe in a next step, to assess these different models of layered a priority. For example, I'm now working also on something, and this whole what you get Wagner, also in the line of Southwest Neo-Kantianism, he really is very sensible towards this whole idea of the origin. And for Rickert, we can say that was, of course, that was very important. And if we then talk about determination of concrete objects, you could say, well, there is a level of constitution where we constitute thinkability at all. And then if we talk about determination of that, what we have thought, then this is, so to say, the entrance in the judgment for the subject matter. So this origin, the next step, so to say, logically, is that we constitute a substrate of possible determinations, and that is a subject concept in the judgment. And then there is a level of constituting the concept of the predicates and of the relationship and so on. And now what you see in Vlag, although in his early work this whole idea of origin was very important, in his later work it completely disappears. There just seems to be, this whole idea of origin is not taken seriously anymore. You get a rather simple idea of constitution. So I think what you now mention indicates just, I would say, a new field of assessment. And then we can also see what exactly is the status in Kant, because I could also reformulate this, that the whole idea of a synthetic unity of perception seems to be missing in the late Vlag. But if that is missing, then we don't at all have a problem of schematism and methodology. So yeah, this becomes more complex the more we know about it. So yeah.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for your presentation. My question goes a bit beyond the scope of these presentations, but I am kind of curious about your opinion on my question. It is as regards the relation between the concept of transcendental, transcendental philosophy within, I mean, not only Kantian philosophy, but also neo-Kantian philosophy, and the concept of transcendental in the field of phenomenology. Because we all know that Husserl was well aware of not only of Kantian philosophy, but also of neo-Kantian philosophy. Windelband, Rickert, and Natter probably the most. And there has been many discussions around this issue, in which sense neo-Kantian philosophy had an influence upon phenomenology. But on the other hand, it is quite clear that Husserl is saying something different. In that sense, I would like to hear your opinion in which sense we might speak about the same concept of transcendental in the same sense as in both traditions.
Well, thank you very much. This is a very interesting question. And indeed, this bothers me for many years too, so maybe I can give you some hints in this respect. So, of course, Husserl has also an internal development. They have this more realistic Husserl, and then, so to say, the transcendental phase. So let's just stick to that one. And then I would say here becomes very important what was called in my talk these two dimensions of justifying objectivity, the subjective root and the objective root. So I will explain why this is important. So we can say what binds Husserl with Kant and neo-Kantianism, so what is, so to say, what do they have in common, is that all of them are of the opinion, if we talk about of the grounds of objectivity, we can only find these grounds in subjectivity. So subjectivity, grounds, objectivity. That is the thesis valid for Husserl, for Kant, maybe not in this terminology, but reason then, and the neo-Kantians. And now the difference start, namely how to conceive of this subjectivity. About what kind of subjectivity are we talking here? Now, and indeed, in neo-Kantianism, around beginning of 1900, there has been a whole dispute about what is called the primacy of practical reason. Because, as I already mentioned, here this whole idea of justifying or understanding foundations is always about a kind of dynamics of reason resulting to some kind of objectivity. And then the problem was, of course, but if that is the case, and if Kant has a distinction between theoretical and practical reason, how do we have to think of that? Is then not whole reason practical reason, like Fichte already said? How then can we understand theoretical reason if theoretical reason is also practical? And now suddenly this whole dimension of, so to say, the result and the act becomes thematic. And Rickert wrote 1909 an essay under the title Zwei Wege der Erkenntnistheorie, two ways, two routes of theory of knowledge. And this is a very interesting article because it's not only about, so to say, neo-Kantian foundations but and theory of truth, but I think it is also a very early statement to Husserl. And what happens there is that he talks about these two routes, so to say, this objective route, discussing the structure of the noema, of the Gehalt, of, so to say, the objective content. And on the one side, and on the other side, objectivity in terms of, we could say, maybe intentionality, to already have a linking concept. And then asks himself, what is exactly the relationship? And then he comes to the conclusion that this objective root or objective dimension has a primacy. Why? Because if I talk about acts and start with acts in terms of activity as a given, in first instance we are talking about natural processes. So in order to have a philosophical reflection, I must already address meaning to them. So that these processes which intend something. But this addressing cannot be justified from the subjective perspective itself. And therefore, the argument is this presupposition of objectivity is exactly the theme of the objective root, and therefore this objective root has a primacy. Now, what we can see in Husserl, I would strictly say, is the other way around. It's, so to say, the subjective root, the subjective logic has a primacy. And then the problem is, how can we then, on this subjective route, guarantee this objectivity, which in first instance was addressed to mere natural processes? And then that means that we need to have certain acts, which, in terms of Husserl, that we need to have certain acts which guarantee the objectivity of the acts. And this is exactly the case in apodictic evidence. So you could say this whole problem of objectivity as a primacy is being dealt with in Husserl in terms of the theorem of apodictic evidence. And then the neo-Kantian idea is to say that that is, so to say, flawed. Because to deduce objectivity, we cannot refer to any type of experience. Also not intuition of essential objects, but we need to have something like a kind of transcendental deduction. So, and therefore I would say both have the idea subjectivity is the grounds for objectivity, but this subjectivity has two dimensions, a noemetic dimension and noetic dimension. Both correlate, also for Husserl, who of course also has this distinction between noesis and noema, but the internal relationship of this correlation, the internal relationship, so we are not talking about realism or something, the internal relationship is that for the neo-Kantians, and I think for Kant too, I will make a last remark on that, but the internal relationship is that the noemetical dimension has a primacy in neo-Kantian theory, and for Husserl, the activity side, the intentionality side, the subjective side has the primacy. So Husserl all the time tries to understand the objectivity from the acts of subjectivity. And this is, so to say, what distinguishes him. Now, concerning Kant, as you know, all of you probably already, Husserl favors the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. And Heidegger even said, well, all essential things are only there in the A deduction, the first deduction. Why? Because Kant rather extensively discusses acts of cognizing, apprehension and so on. And this more or less is also put aside. It is still there in the second edition, but the focus is immediately on the result, on the concept. Now, and but already in the preface of the first edition, he says, well, the subjective deduction, and I think this is essentially the subjective deduction, is important but not essential for my purposes. And therefore we can understand why in the second edition the focus is on this objective side and the concept. And we can also understand why from the perspective of phenomenology the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason is much more interesting. And therefore we could say, well, what the neo-Kantians do is they take serious Kant's remark that the subjective deduction is important but not essential. And for them that would mean then that the primacy is on a level of, or is in the noemetic dimension, not in the noetic dimension. So this is my opinion. But it's really important to see that for all of them, both noemetic and noetic elements are relevant. It's only about the internal structure.
Thank you very much. I'm not trained in Kant's philosophy, but I'm very interested in it.
Or maybe closer to your...
Does it function now?
Well, I hear you anyway, so...
Anyone can hear me?
I don't think so. But I can hear you, so anyone can hear you, yes. One can hear you.
I'm not trained in Kant's philosophy, but I'm very interested in it. So for this reason, I would like to make a question, which is to ask for a clarification. It seems to me that Kant's theory of schematism is not a theory of predication, right? If you take, for example, the judgment snow is white, you have to explain the application of the concept to be white to the subject, which would be the snow. And if Kant would postulate a third element to explain the application of the concept, he would run into a kind of Bradley regress. It seems to me he would have to postulate a fourth element which connects the first three elements, then a fifth element which connects the fourth and so on. So the problem which Kant is dealing with concerns more the act of reference. If I understand it correctly, in referring to snow, you have already a kind of application of concepts, right, which consists in the application of the categories to the content. So in calling it a content or in referring to snow, you already have a kind of judgment, this act of reference.
Right.
And you said that the function of this application is to generate objectivity and validity.
Yeah,
My
concrete.
question would be, you call this determination.
Yes.
The determination of
Yeah.
the concept by concept, but it is not clear to me whether this is also a kind of predication or whether this is an act sui generis, which is completely different from the predication of whiteness of snow. But by calling a thing snow, you are already saying that it is an object, that it is one thing, so you are applying these pure concepts of the category.
Yeah, thank you very much. In fact, I agree, it is not about predication. I think somewhere also said it's rules for the application. We talk about schemas are rules for the application of rules. So and this is so to say, and therefore there is not, I think, at least formally, not an infinite regress, because now we can distinguish between rules and application of the rules, and the rest would again be a rule for the applications on that we have it. But it's indeed not about predication. We can say that we are talking about rules for which orient our predication. And so in that sense I would fully agree with you, but still for Kant thinking is always judging. So whenever we determine an object, we always judge. It's impossible to determine an object without judging. So on any level, also on the application of something, if we have a kind of determination of object, it's always a determination by judgment. The point is only on what level are we talking about object and judgment. Now, and as you pointed out fully correctly, I think, so we can say the object on the level of a category is an object in general, so not snow. We can only say, yeah, if something is snow, it must at least fulfill the condition of being an object in general, otherwise it can also not be snow. But of course, if we have knowledge, we do not talk only about the object in general. We want to know something about snow or water. So now we talk about determination of concrete objects, of concretizing this general determination of an object. And now, therefore, these categories they need to be brought into contact with this much more specific content, or we must say with this appearance, in this case snow. And the scheme is exactly, so to say, the mediating factor which supplies this. And so therefore the scheme is, we could say, nothing but categories interpreted in the relationship to sensibility. And then indeed, if we want to understand this correctly, we are not talking about predicating. That would be a wrong perspective, although we also predicate. Ah, yeah. Yes, is this an answer to your... Yes.
Não tem escritos. Temos tempo para mais perguntas, não precisamos ser tímidos. Bom, professor.
It's a very trivial question for you, I'm sure, but I was interested in this thing that you said just en passant about Gehalt and Inhalt.
Yeah.
Because I never heard something said so clearly.
Oh,
And I was very interested in that because I'm struggling a bit in interpreting Bolzano. Many people think, you know, since it's so modern, you know, you don't need Kant for it. That's not true. So, and I think that this is a distinction that you find there maybe as well, but I never understood really what exactly. I mean, these easy terms, like you said, basically Gehalt is form and content together.
Yeah, right.
So when you think something, so suppose that the object of your thinking is a concept, okay? In the case of Bolzano, a concept is simply a very idea with some characteristics, a Vorstellung an sich with certain characteristics. So the object of the thinking, if you say, you're specifying the Gehalt, what you're doing is simply giving the Inhalt of the concept, but also with the articulation of it.
Right.
Correct?
Right. So I think this is true, and also I think, you know, I made this remark that this distinction between the objective dimension and the subjective dimension plays a role in many thinkers in the 19th century in the second half. Also Bolzano. So I once made a kind of overview of where you can find this, and you find it almost in everybody. So this whole talk about Satz an sich, you know, you talk about the Satz an sich and also the other, the subjective dimension. But then the question is, how do we indeed have to understand this content? And as here we are talking in the perspective of transcendental idealism, it must be that everything which is thought of is always a result of a kind of rational activity. So therefore, it cannot be that that Gehalt and Inhalt are the same. The point is, what we do in philosophy, at least in this perspective, we reflect on the Gehalt. This Gehalt is always bound to some reality. Let's say a proposition. I write something down. I can give it to a chemist, and he can make an analysis of the blue things here. But of course, this also expresses a meaning, and this is the Gehalt. And now we can reflect on the meaning, because the whole point is that this meaning claims some type of validity. And now we start reflecting on, well, under what conditions is this validity plausible, or what conditions should this claim or this proposition fulfill. And in this reflection, we start making a distinction between form and content. And as you pointed out also, if we take a content himself, or a concept, but maybe we could even make it more abstract, and then you have immediately what you want. Suppose you're thinking about the form. Well, then we think about the form. Let's say we talk about the form of the origin, form in general. Well, then we talk about the specific content, in this case the specific content called form in general, in a form. And here you have this. And I fully agree with you. Most people I know just use Gehalt and Inhalt interchangeably, but I think if you really want to understand the foundations of knowledge, that's impossible. So, and I think it's very important. And then it's really about how to conceive of this relationship exactly. But apparently you also agree that the Gehalt is in fact the unity of Inhalt and form. And I think this is the essential point, yes.
Bom, então vamos encerrar por aqui a nossa sessão da manhã. Agradeço ao professor Kriegman. E retornamos então às 14 horas aqui para as conferências do professor Hernan Pringe, professor Dirk Greiman e também minha. Então, muito obrigado.